Snow buried the Black Pine Mountains as a former Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd drove slowly along an old ranger road to inspect an abandoned station. As they passed through a silent pine valley, the dog suddenly raised its head and growled, staring deep into the forest. Following its gaze, the man noticed a small yellow light flickering far between the trees. They stopped the truck and stepped into the snow-covered woods to investigate. Soon they found chaotic footprints and torn cloth scattered across the frozen ground. Moments later, their flashlight revealed two elderly people tied beneath a pine tree, barely alive in the freezing storm. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, and like and subscribe to The Last Command K9 for more powerful stories. The wind moved through the pines like a slow, restless tide. Late winter in northern Montana had a way of stretching time. Days that felt frozen in place. Nights that arrived too early and lingered too long. The Black Pine Ridge rose dark against the pale sky, its long slopes buried beneath snow that had not fully melted since December. Old logging roads wound through the forest like forgotten scars, half buried under drifts and ice. Few people came here anymore. That was exactly why Gideon Rourke was driving into it. The pickup truck was an aging dark green Ford with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only when it wanted to. Gideon drove it slowly along the narrow Forest Service road, his hands steady on the wheel. At 43, Gideon still carried the unmistakable presence of a man who had spent most of his life in disciplined motion. He stood around 6'1", about 1.85 meters, with broad shoulders and the dense, functional build of someone trained for endurance rather than appearance. His face was angular, the jawline sharp, covered in the rough shadow of a short stubble beard that never quite disappeared. His eyes were a pale blue-gray, steady and observant, the kind of eyes that scanned every environment automatically. His skin was weathered from years outdoors, sun-darkened and marked with faint scars. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though now faint streaks of silver touched the temples. The years had changed him, but not softened him. He wore the same clothes he wore almost every day, an olive field jacket that had faded slightly at the seams. Beneath it, a red and dark blue plaid flannel shirt, dark cargo pants tucked into worn brown leather boots. On his wrist sat an old military watch with a fabric strap, scratched but reliable, a folding pocket knife clipped inside his jacket, and behind the passenger seat, a rugged Eberly stock half-track backpack. Everything Gideon carried had purpose. Everything he wore had history. He drove slowly, following the road toward a small, abandoned ranger observation station that the county had asked him to check. A routine inspection. Nothing complicated. Routine suited him. Routine kept certain memories quiet. Gideon had once been a Navy SEAL. Not the kind that told stories in bars or carried the identity like a badge. When he left the service, he left the stories behind too, or tried to. But one mission still followed him. A mission somewhere in the Middle East, years ago. A warehouse. A wounded soldier bleeding out beside him. A choice made in seconds. Save the man, or protect the classified archive they were guarding. Gideon chose the man. The soldier died 3 hours later anyway, and the archive disappeared. The official reports called it a compromised operation. Gideon called it something else. He had saved the wrong thing. The thought had followed him ever since. The truck rolled slowly through a long curve in the road. Beside him, something shifted. Relic lifted his head. The German Shepherd had been lying quietly on the passenger seat until that moment. Now he sat upright, ears angled forward. Relic was about 8 or 9 years old now, older for a working K9, but still strong. His coat was thick and short, black across the back with deep golden fur along the legs and chest. The dog's body was lean and muscular, built for quick movement rather than bulk. A simple black leather collar circled his neck, worn smooth from years of use. But the most striking thing about Relic was always the eyes. Dark, intelligent, constantly working. He didn't bark often. He didn't need to. Relic's warning was usually silence. Right now he wasn't barking. He was staring, his nose lifted slightly toward the windshield. Then he gave a low, quiet growl. Gideon noticed immediately. Relic placed both front paws on the dashboard, his muscles tense. "What is it?" Gideon murmured. The dog did not look at him. His gaze stayed locked on the forest ahead. Gideon slowed the truck and followed Relic's line of sight. At first he saw nothing. Only snow-covered trees, the wind shifting through branches. Then he saw it. Far beyond the edge of the road, deep in the woods, something flickered. A tiny point of yellow light. It glowed faintly through the snowfall. Gideon squinted. A lantern. It swayed gently in the wind. Not a house light. Not a vehicle. A lantern. Out here. Relic's growl deepened. Gideon frowned. Nobody hiked this area in winter. Not at night. Not during wind like this. He kept the truck moving another 10 yards, then 20. Then he stopped. The engine idled for a moment. Gideon stared at the light again through the windshield. It flickered once, then steadied. Relic did not move. Gideon exhaled slowly. Some instincts never left a soldier. Something about that light felt wrong. He turned off the engine. The sudden quiet of the forest pressed in around them. Relic jumped down from the seat before Gideon even opened the door. Snow crunched under their boots as they stepped into the cold. The wind smelled like pine and frozen earth. Relic moved first, nose low, body alert. Gideon followed. They left the road and stepped into the forest. Branches brushed against Gideon's jacket as they pushed through the trees. The lantern flickered ahead between trunks, about 100 meters deeper into the woods. The snow here was disturbed. Relic slowed. He lowered his head and sniffed. Footprints. Not just one person, several. Gideon crouched beside the tracks. 2 sets were clear. Boot prints, one heavier than the other. Then something else. A dragged line in the snow. Like someone had stumbled or been pulled. Relic's ears twitched. He moved forward again. 10 steps later, Gideon saw something caught on a branch. A strip of wool. He reached up and pulled it free. A scarf. Gray, thick, the kind older people wore in winter. Not new, not military. Civilian. Gideon's stomach tightened slightly. He looked again toward the lantern. It swayed gently in the wind. Still burning. Relic moved again. The dog's pace quickened. The forest thickened around them. Snow creaked underfoot. Then, Relic froze. Not barked, not lunged, just stopped. Every muscle in the dog's body locked into place. His ears went forward, his tail stiffened. The low growl returned. Gideon had seen that posture many times before. It meant danger, but it also meant certainty. Something was there. Gideon stepped forward slowly. The lantern hung from a low branch of a pine tree. The light illuminated the snow beneath it. At first, Gideon thought the shadows were branches. Then he realized they were not. 2 shapes hung beneath the tree. Human shapes. For a split second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. Then the image snapped into focus. 2 people, an elderly man and woman, their wrists tied to rope that ran over the branch above them. Their feet barely touched the snow. They were hanging, alive, or trying to be. Relic barked once, sharp and sudden. Gideon ran. The man's head lifted weakly when Gideon reached them. He was thin, with gray hair plastered against his forehead and a beard that had gone mostly white with age. His coat was a worn brown-gray wool jacket, the kind someone might have owned for decades. His eyes opened just enough to focus. "Please," the man rasped. The woman beside him hung almost unconscious. She was smaller, wrapped in a gray-blue coat and cream sweater, her silver hair half hidden under a knit cap. Snow had gathered on their boots. They had been here for a while. Gideon pulled out his knife and cut the rope. The man collapsed into the snow with a weak gasp. Relic circled them quickly, nose working. Gideon lowered the woman carefully. Her pulse was faint. Hypothermia. The old man struggled to sit up. "My wife," he whispered hoarsely. Gideon nodded. "She's alive." Relic suddenly turned toward the darkness beyond the lantern. The dog growled again, a deeper sound this time. Gideon looked up sharply. The forest behind them was silent. But the dog's instincts never lied. Something had been here, and might still be. Gideon glanced back at the two elderly strangers lying in the snow. The lantern above them flickered in the wind. For reasons he could not explain, Gideon had the sudden feeling that the light had not been left here by accident. Almost as if it had been meant to be found. The wind shifted again across the ridge, carrying a dry hiss of snow through the trees. Gideon Rourke felt it immediately. The subtle change in the air that soldiers learn to notice long before they understand why. The forest had grown too quiet. He stood beside the open doorway of the abandoned observation shack, his breath drifting in pale clouds, while Relic remained frozen a few yards away in the snow. The German shepherd's posture had changed. Relic's ears were pointed sharply forward, his body rigid, tail lowered, but steady. He was staring toward the dark tree line behind them. That posture meant one thing. Someone had been there, maybe seconds ago. Gideon didn't speak. He trusted the dog more than any instinct of his own. Instead, he crouched beside the two elderly strangers lying in the snow and checked them again. The old man, Elias Van, was breathing hard but steady now. Up close, Gideon could see more clearly what time had done to him. Elias was tall but thin, the sort of man who had probably spent most of his life doing physical work. His shoulders were narrow beneath his heavy wool coat, and his hands were rough with the thick calluses of someone who had worked with tools for decades. His beard had gone almost entirely white, but his eyes still held a stubborn spark. His wife, Martha Van, lay beside him, smaller and fragile-looking beneath her thick gray-blue coat. Her silver hair had slipped partly free from beneath her knit cap, and frost had formed along the strands. Her breathing was shallow, the slow rhythm of someone slipping toward hypothermia. Gideon removed his gloves and gently pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse. Weak. But there. "She's still with us," Gideon said quietly. Elias nodded faintly, relief softening the deep lines in his face. Relic let out a low growl again. Gideon glanced back toward the trees. Nothing moved. Still, the feeling lingered, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Inside," Gideon said. He slid one arm beneath Martha's shoulders and helped Elias stand. The old man tried to carry some of his wife's weight, though his legs trembled badly. Step by step they moved toward the observation shack. The structure had once been a ranger snow station decades earlier. Now it looked more like a collapsed memory of a building. The roof sagged slightly under old snow, and several windows had long since shattered, leaving the interior exposed to the wind. But the walls still stood, and right now, that was enough. Gideon pushed the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was colder but calmer. Snow had blown through cracks in the walls, leaving thin drifts along the wooden floor. A rusted iron stove sat in one corner, its pipe bent but still connected to the chimney. Gideon eased Martha onto a pile of old blankets that someone had left years ago. Then he turned back to Elias. "Can you stay awake?" The old man nodded slowly. "I'll try." Gideon knelt beside the stove and began clearing out old ash. His movements were efficient, practiced. Small survival habits that never really left soldiers who had spent years in harsh places. Within minutes, he had a small fire going. Warm light flickered against the wooden walls. Relic stepped inside and immediately moved to the doorway again, sitting with his back to the room while watching the forest. Guarding. Always guarding. Gideon returned to Martha and unzipped her coat slightly, trying to warm her slowly without shocking her system. Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, she stared up at him with unfocused eyes. Then her expression softened. "Noah," she whispered weakly. The name lingered in the air. Elias closed his eyes. Gideon didn't correct her. Sometimes truth wasn't the most important thing. "Let's get you warm first," he said gently. Elias coughed into his sleeve, the sound rough and deep. "They asked about it," he murmured. Gideon looked up. "The metal tube?" "Right." Gideon reached into Martha's coat pocket and removed the object he had found earlier. The cylinder was about 6 inches long, made of dull steel, its surface scratched but still solid. One end had a small screw cap. Near the center, faint markings were stamped into the metal. Military markings, old ones. Cold unease stirred in Gideon's chest. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Elias leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly. "Up the ridge," he said, "near the old concrete base." "The old station?" The old man nodded. "There used to be something there years ago. Military equipment, maybe. My son talked about it once." "Noah." Gideon unscrewed the cap carefully. Inside was a tightly rolled strip of yellowed paper. He pulled it free and flattened it gently on the floor. A map, not large, but detailed, coordinates, and a symbol Gideon recognized immediately. His stomach tightened. That symbol belonged to a classified storage archive used during covert operations decades earlier. A storage archive that had supposedly been destroyed. Elias watched his expression. "You know what it is?" Gideon didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind rattled the broken window frames. Relic's ears twitched. Then suddenly the dog stood. His growl returned, low, focused. Gideon turned sharply. "What is it?" Relic stepped out the doorway into the snow. Gideon followed. The forest was darker now. Snow still drifted slowly through the branches. At first, Gideon saw nothing. Then Relic walked 20 feet into the clearing and stopped. He lowered his nose and began digging. Snow scattered under his paws. Within seconds, he uncovered something half buried beneath the surface. A boot print. Fresh. Too fresh. Gideon crouched beside it. The tread pattern was sharp, military-style winter boots, and the track was pointing toward the shack. Someone had been standing here, watching them. Relic suddenly stopped digging. The dog lifted his head slowly and stared toward a distant line of trees beyond the clearing. His body didn't move, not even his tail. For a moment, Gideon felt something strange ripple through the quiet forest. The wind faded. The snow stopped falling. It was only for a second. But in that second, Gideon had the eerie sense that someone else, far away in the darkness, was looking directly back at them. Relic gave a single sharp bark. Then silence returned. Gideon exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. I feel it too. Back inside the shack, Elias had managed to sit upright. Martha's breathing had steadied slightly, though she still shivered beneath the blankets. Gideon rolled the map closed again. "Those men," he said. "Did they say anything else?" Elias nodded faintly. One of them kept asking about the coordinates. "What did he look like?" The old man frowned as he tried to remember. "Tall," he said slowly. "Very tall. Thin face. Scar on his neck." Gideon's heart skipped. Scar, neck. He knew that description. Silas Creed. A name that belonged to a man Gideon had once served beside and later hunted across half a continent. A man who had disappeared years ago. Officially dead. Gideon stared down at the map again. So the archive hadn't disappeared after all. It had just been waiting. Outside the shack, the wind returned. Relic remained near the doorway, silent again. Watching, always watching. The fire inside the abandoned observation shack crackled softly, its orange light licking the cracked wooden walls and pushing back the cold that seeped through every gap in the boards. Gideon Rourke stood near the broken window, the old map still in his hand. Outside, the snow had thickened again. The forest beyond the clearing blurred into shifting shadows as wind carried powder through the trees. But Gideon's attention was no longer on the weather. It was on the man standing beyond the tree line. Silas Creed. For several seconds, Gideon didn't move. The name alone pulled memories from places in his mind he had spent years trying to bury. Silas Creed had once been many things. Contractor, intelligence courier, sometimes ally, sometimes liability. But what Gideon remembered most clearly was the man himself. Tall, almost unnaturally tall, 6'3" at least. Lean in the way of men who burned energy constantly, but never wasted motion. His face had always been narrow and angular, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that rarely blinked when he studied someone. The scar on his neck was unmistakable. A long pale line that curved down from beneath his ear toward his collarbone. It had come from a knife fight years ago during an operation in Syria. Gideon remembered the moment vividly. Silas standing in a dusty courtyard, blood soaking through his collar, smiling like the wound amused him. Silas had always smiled like that. Like pain was just another inconvenience. Now the same man stood in the snow beyond the shack. Alive. Very much alive. The lantern light from the clearing barely touched him, but Gideon could see enough. Silas wore a dark winter parka, heavy tactical pants, and military-grade boots designed for snow terrain. A dark wool scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, partly covering the scar, but not hiding it. One hand rested casually inside his coat pocket. The other hung loosely at his side. He wasn't aiming a weapon. That was worse, because it meant he didn't feel threatened. Inside the shack, Elias Van watched Gideon's face change. The old man's voice trembled. "That's him," Elias whispered. Gideon nodded once, without turning. Relic had moved closer to the doorway now. The German shepherd stood with his head low, muscles tight beneath his black and gold coat. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, not loud but steady. The sound of a dog who had identified a threat and was waiting for permission. Silas took one step forward into the edge of the clearing. The snow crunched beneath his boot. "Good evening, Gideon." His voice carried easily through the cold air, smooth, calm, almost conversational. The kind of voice that could talk someone into trusting him, or into stepping into a trap. "You always did have a talent," Silas continued, "for finding trouble." Gideon stepped out of the shack slowly. The cold hit him immediately, sharp against his face. He closed the door behind him. Better to keep the old couple inside. Better to keep them out of this conversation. Relic followed him out and stopped at his side. Silas glanced at the dog and tilted his head slightly. That must be Relic. His voice held faint amusement. Still alive, I see. Gideon didn't answer. Silas studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning Gideon's posture, the distance between them, the surrounding terrain, the way a hunter studied the environment before deciding how to move. You look older, Silas said finally. Everyone does eventually. Not you, Gideon replied. Silas smiled faintly. No, he agreed. I suppose I don't. Snow drifted sideways between them. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Silas nodded toward the shack. You're sheltering the old couple? Yeah. They found something that belongs to me. Gideon said nothing. Silas's smile faded slightly. You've opened the cylinder, he said. It wasn't a question. Gideon kept his voice level. Why were you interrogating two people in their 80s? Silas shrugged. They picked up something valuable. They're civilians. So? The answer came too easily. Gideon felt a familiar anger rise inside his chest. Silas saw it immediately. His smile returned. That temper of yours, he said softly, still intact. Relic suddenly stepped forward, not barking, not lunging, just walking slowly toward Silas. The dog's nose lifted slightly, testing the air. For a moment, Gideon wondered if the dog had made a mistake. But Relic never made mistakes. The German shepherd stopped 10 feet from Silas. His head tilted slightly, and then something unexpected happened. Relic didn't growl. He simply stared. Silas looked down at the dog with mild curiosity. Well, he said quietly, that's interesting. His eyes shifted briefly to Gideon. Your dog remembers me. Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. Years earlier, during an operation overseas, Relic had been barely a year old. A young military dog, learning scent tracking and explosive detection. Silas had been there then. Relic took one step closer. Then suddenly the dog's ears flattened. A deep growl rolled from his chest. The recognition had come. Not friend, enemy. The forest seemed to hold its breath again. Silas chuckled softly. There it is. Silas lifted his gaze back to Gideon. I'm going to ask for the cylinder, he said. Gideon crossed his arms. No. Silas sighed faintly, as if disappointed by a predictable outcome. You never were good at choosing the easy path. That's because the easy path usually gets people killed. Silas nodded once. Sometimes. His eyes flicked briefly toward the shack. I assume the old man told you about the map. He told me enough. And what did you conclude? That whatever's buried up there, Gideon said slowly, you don't want anyone else finding it. Silas didn't answer immediately. The wind shifted again, sending a swirl of snow between them. Finally, he said quietly, you remember the archive. Gideon felt the memory tighten in his chest. The warehouse, the mission, the night everything went wrong. That archive was destroyed, Gideon said. Silas's smile sharpened. No, it was moved. He took another slow step closer. Hidden and forgotten. Gideon's eyes hardened. You're wrong. Silas's expression changed slightly. Not anger, something colder. No, Gideon, he said softly. You're wrong. Inside the shack, a board creaked. Elias must have shifted against the wall. Silas glanced briefly toward the sound, then back to Gideon. I'm not here to kill anyone tonight, he said. The statement sounded almost polite. I'm here for what belongs to me. And if I say no? Silas shrugged. Then we continue this conversation somewhere less comfortable. Relic's growl deepened. Gideon took a slow breath. "You should have stayed dead," he said quietly. Silas smiled again. "I tried." The wind rose suddenly, rattling branches above them. Silas stepped backward toward the trees, but his eyes never left Gideon. "We'll talk again soon," he said. Then he vanished into the forest, not running, just disappearing between the snow-covered pines as if the woods had swallowed him. Relic watched the darkness for several seconds. Then he barked once. Sharp and angry, Gideon remained where he stood. The cold crept through his jacket now, but he barely felt it, because he understood something with terrifying clarity. Silas Creed hadn't come here to fight. He had come here to confirm something. That Gideon had the map, and that Gideon would follow it. Slowly, Gideon turned back toward the shack. Inside, the fire still burned. The old couple waited. And somewhere high on Black Pine Ridge, beneath frozen ground and forgotten concrete, a secret from 50 years ago was waiting to be found. The fire inside the observation shack had burned low. Only a few stubborn embers remained in the rusted iron stove, glowing faintly in the dim interior. Outside, the wind had shifted again, sending long sheets of snow sweeping across the clearing, like pale ghosts drifting through the trees. Gideon Rourke stood near the floorboards, where Relic had been digging. The German shepherd had already uncovered part of what lay beneath the snow-dusted wood. Beneath the boards was a rusted metal hatch, half hidden beneath debris and ice. Relic's paws scraped softly against the edge of the hatch as he worked, his muscles tense beneath his thick black and gold coat. The dog's breathing was steady but alert. Every few seconds his ears twitched toward the forest. Gideon knelt beside him. "Good boy," he murmured quietly. Relic stopped digging and stepped aside. Gideon brushed away the remaining snow and pried open the hatch with the edge of his knife. A hollow sound echoed beneath the floor. Below the shack was a narrow maintenance tunnel. Cold air rose from the opening like the breath of the earth itself. The tunnel sloped downward into darkness. Behind Gideon, Elias Van coughed weakly. The old man had managed to sit upright against the wall, though exhaustion still pulled heavily at his thin frame. His beard trembled slightly as he spoke. "You're leaving," Elias said. Gideon nodded once. "We don't stay here." Elias looked toward the door. "They'll come back." "They already have." Across the room, Martha stirred under the blankets Gideon had wrapped around her earlier. Her breathing had grown steadier since the fire warmed the room, but she remained pale, her eyes half closed. Her voice was faint when she spoke. "Where are we going?" Gideon looked back at the tunnel. "Downhill," he said. "The ridge will give us cover." Relic turned his head suddenly. The dog's body stiffened again. Outside. Footsteps, not loud, but deliberate. Crunch, crunch. Someone was walking across the clearing. Gideon moved quickly. He grabbed his backpack and stuffed the rolled map inside. Then he crouched beside Elias. "Can you climb?" The old man gave a humorless smile. "At my age?" Gideon didn't return the smile. "You'll manage." Relic slipped through the open hatch first, landing silently in the tunnel below. Gideon helped Elias down next, then carefully lifted Martha and lowered her into the narrow space. The tunnel smelled of rust and damp earth. Old electrical cables ran along the walls, their insulation cracked from decades of cold. Gideon climbed down last. He pulled the hatch closed above them just as the shack door creaked open. The sound echoed faintly through the metal floor. Someone had entered the building. Gideon switched on a small flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness of the tunnel, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for one person at a time. Relic was already moving forward, his paws silent against the metal grating. The tunnel angled downward toward the mountain slope. Behind them, faint voices drifted through the floor. One of them Gideon recognized, Silas Creed. Another voice answered him, a second man. The tunnel ended nearly 50 yards downhill, where a rusted emergency ladder led upward toward a metal grate hidden beneath thick brush. Gideon pushed the grate open slowly. Cold night air flooded the tunnel. They had emerged halfway down the ridge. The trees here grew thicker, the branches tangled together above the slope like a dark canopy. Perfect terrain for hiding, but also perfect terrain for hunters. Gideon helped Elias climb out first, then Martha. Relic emerged last, shaking snow from his coat before immediately turning toward the forest. The dog moved ahead several yards, Osmo low, tracking. Gideon followed his movement. "Find us a path," he murmured. Relic continued forward. Halfway down the ridge, Relic suddenly stopped. Not the alert freeze he used when sensing danger. This time, something else held him still. The dog lifted his head slowly and sniffed the air. Then he stepped sideways into the trees and began pawing at the snow. Gideon approached cautiously. "What is it?" Relic scraped harder. Snow scattered away from a small mound beneath a fallen pine branch. Within seconds, the dog uncovered something buried beneath the drift, wood. A narrow wooden marker. Gideon brushed the snow away and saw faded letters carved into the surface. Noah Van, 1973 to 1994. A memorial cross. The old man behind him let out a broken breath. "My boy," Elias whispered. Gideon stared at the marker. The memorial sat only a few yards from the tunnel exit. The lantern the old couple had carried must have been meant for this place. Relic stepped back quietly. For a moment, the forest felt strangely still. Even the wind seemed to ease. Gideon wasn't a man who believed easily in signs. But standing beside the grave of a soldier who had died decades earlier, while his parents hid only yards away from death, something about the moment felt deliberate, as if the ridge itself had drawn them here. Gideon stood slowly. "We move," he said quietly. The hunt wasn't over. They continued downhill. The slope steepened quickly, forcing them to move slowly between rocks and thick brush. Relic guided them through narrow spaces between fallen trees, choosing routes that kept them hidden beneath dense branches. Gideon understood what the dog was doing. Relic wasn't just navigating. He was thinking like a tracker. Avoid open ground, break the line of sight, control the scent trail. Years of working together meant Gideon could read the dog's decisions without a word. Behind them, somewhere above the ridge, a gunshot cracked through the forest. Then another. Warning shots. Silas testing the silence, letting them know he was there. Elias stumbled slightly as they descended. Gideon caught his arm. "You good?" The old man nodded, though his breath came hard. "Better than hanging from a tree." They moved on. Minutes later, the ridge flattened into a narrow ravine where a frozen stream cut through the forest. The ice looked solid. But Gideon knew better. Streams like this froze unevenly. Some sections held, others didn't. Relic stopped at the edge of the ice. He sniffed the surface carefully, then stepped sideways and followed the bank instead. Gideon trusted the choice. They moved along the ravine. Above them, faint light flickered through the trees. Lantern light. Gideon stopped. Silas had reached the shack. Relic turned back toward the ridge. The dog's ears flicked once, listening. Then he looked at Gideon. Gideon understood the message. Silas had seen the tunnel. He would follow. And the chase had truly begun. High above them, inside the abandoned observation shack, Silas Creed knelt beside the open hatch. The lantern he had picked up from the clearing hung from a nail on the wall, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Silas studied the tunnel entrance for several seconds. His narrow face remained calm. Then he smiled faintly. "Smart move," he murmured. Behind him stood the second man, a broad-shouldered hunter named Darren Holt. Holt was in his early 40s, thick-necked and heavily built, with a square beard that looked more like a block of iron than hair. His nose had been broken more than once, leaving it slightly crooked across his face. He had once been a wilderness guide before turning to less respectable work, tracking people through forests for money. "What now?" Holt asked. Silas rose slowly. "Now?" He picked up the lantern. "Now we hunt." Silas stepped toward the tunnel, and far below the ridge, Gideon, Rourke, and Relic moved deeper into the forest. The ravine deepened as Gideon Rourke guided the group through the forest. The slope had become steeper now, forcing them to move sideways along the side of the ridge instead of straight down. Snow clung to every branch, and the wind carried the constant whisper of frozen pine needles brushing together overhead. Gideon moved first. Relic moved second. Behind them came Elias Van, his thin frame trembling under the effort of each step. At 84, the old man was pushing far beyond what his body had been built for. His gray beard had frozen slightly along the edges where breath touched it, and every exhale came out in slow, uneven clouds. But he kept moving, because his wife was leaning against him. Martha Van walked between the two men, her weight partly supported by Gideon's steady arm. Her silver hair peeked from beneath the wool cap she still wore, strands catching the wind as if they were threads of frost. Her breathing had improved since the fire in the shack, but exhaustion and cold still clung to her. Every few minutes, she murmured something under her breath. Most of the time, it was the same name. Noah. Gideon didn't correct her. There was no kindness in forcing reality into someone who was barely conscious. Relic stopped suddenly ahead of them. The German shepherd stood with his nose lifted toward the dark woods beyond the ravine. His black and gold coat was dusted with snow now, but his posture remained steady and disciplined. His ears turned slowly, listening. The dog moved again, but this time he angled farther down the slope instead of along the ridge. Gideon followed. "What is it?" Elias whispered hoarsely. "Something changed," Gideon said. The terrain began to flatten slightly. A frozen stream wound through the ravine ahead of them, its surface hidden beneath thick snow and uneven ice. The water beneath still moved slowly, carving a narrow trench through the valley floor. Crossing here would be risky, but staying on the same side would keep them exposed along the ridge. Relic approached the stream carefully. The dog lowered his head and sniffed the surface. Then he moved upstream a few yards. There, half buried in snow and shadow, stood a structure Gideon had not noticed from above. An old wooden bridge. The bridge had once been a service crossing for maintenance crews decades earlier. Now the boards sagged slightly, and the rope cables that once reinforced the sides had frayed into stiff gray strands. The structure looked like it had survived more winters than it should have. Gideon studied it carefully. The span crossed the narrowest section of the ravine, maybe 15 feet across. Beneath the bridge, the ice looked darker, thin in places. Crossing directly through the stream would be worse. Relic stepped onto the first plank. The board creaked softly but held. The dog turned back and looked at Gideon, waiting. "All right," Gideon murmured. He helped Martha forward first. "Slow steps." The boards shifted slightly under their weight as they moved across. Each step echoed faintly in the ravine. Halfway across, Martha's foot slipped slightly on the frost-covered wood. Gideon tightened his grip on her arm. "You're okay," he said quietly. Behind them, Elias followed carefully, gripping the rope railing. The old man's breathing had grown heavier now, but he refused to stop. Relic reached the far side first. The dog stepped off the bridge and turned immediately back toward the ridge they had descended from. His body stiffened again. Gideon saw it instantly. Someone was coming. Before Gideon could say anything, the forest erupted with sound. A long, low howl echoed across the ravine. Then another, and another. The sound rolled through the trees like a wave moving through dark water. Relic stepped forward, positioning himself between the group and the tree line. The German shepherd lowered his body slightly, ears upright, head forward, not aggressive, not afraid, prepared. From the shadows between the pines, shapes emerged. Gray wolves, 5 of them. Their coats blended perfectly with the snowy forest, thick fur rippling as they moved silently across the ridge above the ravine. The largest wolf stood slightly ahead of the others, its pale yellow eyes fixed on the small group below. Elias froze. "My God," he whispered. Gideon didn't move. Running would trigger pursuit. Standing calm sometimes didn't. Relic held his position. The wolves studied him, not barking, not attacking, just watching. The largest wolf stepped forward 2 paces. Relic's tail stiffened slightly. For several seconds, the 2 animals stared at one another. Then the wolf turned its head. The pack shifted. And just like that, they melted back into the forest. Gone as quietly as they had appeared. The ravine fell silent again. Gideon exhaled slowly. But the moment of relief didn't last, because another sound followed. A gunshot. The crack echoed across the valley. A bullet slammed into the tree trunk beside the bridge. Splinters exploded into the air. "Move!" Gideon shouted. He shoved Martha toward the far side of the ravine. Another shot rang out. The second bullet tore through one of the bridge cables. The rope snapped with a sharp whip-like crack. The bridge lurched violently. Elias stumbled but caught the railing. Relic barked sharply. From the ridge above them, a figure stepped into view. Silas Creed, tall, still, watching. Behind him stood the massive shape of Darren Holt, rifle raised and steady. Holt fired again. This time the shot struck the remaining cable. The bridge groaned under the sudden imbalance. Wood splintered. Boards shifted beneath Gideon's boots. "Martha, go!" Gideon shouted. She stepped forward quickly, but the sudden movement caused one of the planks to tilt. Her foot slid. Her body lurched sideways toward the edge of the bridge. For a split second she hung there. Then gravity took hold. Martha slipped off the side of the bridge. Her cry barely left her throat before Relic launched forward. The German shepherd lunged across the remaining planks with explosive speed. His jaws snapped onto the thick fabric of Martha's coat. The dog dug his paws into the wood as the old woman dangled over the ravine. The bridge jerked again. Relic growled through clenched teeth. Gideon reached them in 2 strides. He grabbed Martha's arm and pulled upward with all his strength. Elias crawled forward on his knees to help. Together they hauled her back onto the bridge, but as Gideon lifted her, a sharp splinter of wood snapped upward beneath Relic's front leg. The jagged board sliced through the dog's paw. Relic yelped once, then collapsed onto the bridge boards. Blood spread across the snow-dusted wood. "No," Gideon muttered. He scooped the dog into his arms quickly. Relic's body trembled, but the dog didn't struggle. His eyes remained focused on Gideon's face. The trust in them hit harder than the gunfire. Behind them, the bridge gave one final violent groan. The remaining support rope snapped. "Jump!" Gideon shouted. He leapt forward with Relic in his arms. Elias and Martha stumbled after him onto solid ground. Behind them, the bridge collapsed. Wood, rope, and ice crashed into the ravine below. The sound echoed through the forest like thunder. Gideon turned back just in time to see Silas standing on the far side of the broken crossing. Snow swirled around him. The tall man rested one hand casually on his rifle. He didn't look angry. He didn't look rushed. He simply watched. The distance between them had suddenly become a canyon. Silas gave a small nod across the ravine, almost like a hunter acknowledging the start of a longer chase. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. Gideon knelt in the snow and lowered Relic gently onto the ground. The dog's injured paw bled steadily. Gideon tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped it tightly around the wound. Relic whined softly, but didn't pull away. Gideon rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Not this time." His jaw tightened. "Not losing anyone tonight." Relic's tail tapped weakly against the snow. The forest around them grew quiet again. But Gideon knew something had changed. The hunt had become something else now. Something personal. The forest slowly thinned as Gideon led the group deeper into the valley. The broken bridge was far behind them now, hidden somewhere upstream beneath twisted timber and shattered ice. The ravine had widened here, opening into a frozen basin where an old logging lake stretched across the valley floor. The wind had calmed, but the cold felt sharper. Gideon could feel it creeping through the layers of his olive field jacket, biting at the exposed skin of his neck and hands. His breath rose in slow white clouds as he moved through the snow beside the shoreline. Relic limped ahead of him. The German shepherd's injured paw had been wrapped tightly with a strip of cloth torn from Gideon's flannel shirt. The improvised bandage was already dark with blood, but the dog continued forward stubbornly, his head low and focused on the air. Relic had always been like that. Pain rarely slowed him. Duty mattered more. Behind Gideon, Elias Van struggled with every step. The old man's tall frame had grown more fragile over the past hour. His shoulders hunched forward as the cold crept deeper into his bones. Snow clung to the edges of his coat and beard, and his breathing had become rough and uneven. But he refused to stop, not while Martha still leaned against him. Martha Van walked between them, her strength fading in waves. Her pale face carried the distant expressions of someone drifting between exhaustion and memory. Sometimes she spoke softly. Sometimes she simply stared ahead. "Is that the lake?" Elias asked weakly. Gideon nodded. "Yeah." The frozen surface of the lake stretched across nearly half a mile of valley floor. Snow covered the ice like a pale blanket, broken only by dark patches where the wind had swept the surface clean. Near the southern edge of the lake stood an old wooden structure. A boathouse. The building leaned slightly toward the water, its roof sagging under decades of winter storms. Most of the paint had peeled away, leaving gray planks exposed to the elements. But it still stood, and right now, it was shelter. "Inside," Gideon said. Relic reached the structure first. The dog pushed his way through the half-open door and stepped onto the warped wooden floor. Gideon helped Elias and Martha inside. The interior smelled of old timber and frozen water. Dust-covered shelves lined one wall, and a long wooden workbench sat beneath a broken window. Rusted hooks hung from the ceiling where fishing nets had once been stored decades earlier. It was quiet, safe enough for the moment. Gideon lowered Relic onto the floor carefully. The dog lay down without protest. Gideon knelt beside him. "Let's take a look." He unwound the makeshift bandage. The wound across the dog's paw was deeper than he had hoped, but the bleeding had slowed. Gideon cleaned the cut with snow and wrapped it again, tighter this time. Relic watched him quietly, his dark eyes steady. When Gideon finished, the dog nudged his hand once with his nose. A small gesture, but Gideon understood it. Still working, still loyal. Across the room, Elias had guided Martha onto a wooden bench. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. "She'll sleep," he said quietly. "Let her." Martha's eyes were already closing again. Her breathing had become shallow but steady. Gideon stood and walked toward the open doorway of the boathouse. The frozen lake stretched into the darkness beyond. For several minutes, he simply watched the far side of the valley. The forest there looked black and endless. If Silas found a way around the ravine, he would come from that direction. The wind shifted again. Gideon noticed something, a faint glow far across the lake. He narrowed his eyes. Light. A lantern. The beam flickered weakly through the snow, not steady like a campfire, not bright like headlights, just a small yellow glow moving slowly between the trees. Gideon's mind raced through possibilities. Silas. A hunter. Or something else. Behind him, Relic lifted his head. The dog sniffed the air, his ears turned toward the lake. Relic struggled to his feet. The injured paw trembled slightly under his weight, but the dog ignored the pain. He limped toward the doorway and stopped beside Gideon. The German shepherd sniffed the wind again. Then something unexpected happened. Relic didn't growl. He wagged his tail once, just once. A small, uncertain movement. Gideon frowned. That reaction didn't match the danger they were facing. Relic stepped forward onto the frozen shoreline. Then he turned back toward Gideon, waiting, as if inviting him to follow. Gideon hesitated. The lantern across the lake flickered again. Relic took another step onto the ice. Careful, slow. The dog looked back again. Gideon felt a strange pull in his chest. Trust the dog. He had done it 1,000 times before. Gideon grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the frozen lake. The ice creaked softly beneath his boots. Behind him, Elias called weakly from inside the boathouse. "What is it?" "Stay inside," Gideon replied. Then he followed Relic into the snow-covered expanse. The lantern light grew brighter as they approached the opposite shoreline. Relic moved faster now, his injured leg slowing him but not stopping him. When they reached the trees, the light source came into view. A woman stood beside the lantern. She held it high in one hand while scanning the forest around her. Her posture was tense, but controlled. The woman was in her mid-30s, tall and athletic with sharp features and determined eyes. Her brown hair was tied back in a tight ponytail beneath a dark sheriff's cap, and she wore a forest green sheriff's jacket over tactical pants and heavy winter boots. A holstered sidearm rested against her hip. Her name was Clara Van, and the moment she saw Gideon, she lowered the lantern slightly. Relief flashed across her face. "You found them," she said. Her voice was steady but thick with emotion. Clara Van had her father's eyes, sharp and stubborn. But unlike Elias, her body carried the strength of someone trained to move through danger. Years working as a deputy sheriff in the county had carved discipline into her movements. "Where are they?" she asked quickly. "Boathouse," Gideon replied. "They're alive." Clara exhaled slowly. Thank God. Behind her stood another man, a deputy in his early 40s with a square jaw and a broad build that filled his winter patrol jacket. His name was Marcus Hale, a longtime officer in the county sheriff's department. Marcus had the calm demeanor of someone who had spent years responding to emergencies without panicking. His dark beard was trimmed close to his face, and his eyes moved constantly across the forest around them. He carried a shotgun slung across his shoulder. "We tracked them as far as the ravine," Marcus said. Then his eyes fell to Relic's bandaged paw. "Looks like you had a rough crossing." "Bridge collapsed," Gideon replied. Marcus nodded slowly. "Figures." Clara turned back toward the lake. "Let's go get them." They had taken only a few steps when the forest exploded with sound. A gunshot cracked through the trees. The bullet struck the ice 10 feet from Gideon, sending a spray of frozen shards into the air. Clara dropped the lantern and drew her sidearm in one smooth motion. Marcus swung the shotgun forward. From somewhere in the darkness behind them came a familiar voice, cold, amused. Silas Creed. "Well," he called out from the forest, "that saves me the trouble of searching the entire valley." The trees around them seemed to close in. Relic growled. The hunt had reached the lake. The first sound Gideon heard after the gunshot was the ice cracking. Not breaking, just cracking. A thin spiderweb of sound moving across the frozen lake beneath his boots. He didn't move. Neither did Clara. The lantern she had dropped moments earlier lay on its side in the snow, its warm yellow glow spilling across the ice like a fragile circle of sunlight. The forest behind them had gone completely silent. Gideon Rourke slowly lowered his center of gravity, his instincts shifting into the same quiet awareness that had once kept him alive on battlefields half a world away. Beside him, Relic's growl rolled deep in his chest. The German shepherd stood with his injured paw lifted slightly off the ice, his weight balanced carefully on the other 3 legs. Blood had seeped through the cloth bandage Gideon had wrapped earlier, leaving a faint trail across the snow behind them. But the dog's posture remained unwavering, protective, focused. Clara Van moved with equal precision. At 34, Clara had the kind of calm strength that came from years of facing emergencies head-on. She was tall and athletic, with sharp cheekbones and determined brown eyes that reflected the lantern light like polished stone. Her dark hair was tied back tightly beneath her sheriff's cap, and her forest green department jacket carried the faint white emblem of the county sheriff's office on its shoulder. The pistol in her hand did not tremble. Deputy Marcus Hale stepped slightly to her right, raising his shotgun. Marcus was built like someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, and a square jaw framed by a short, dark beard. His movements were slow and measured, every motion controlled. He spoke quietly. "Where?" The answer came before Gideon could reply. Another voice drifted from the tree line, smooth, confident. Silas Creed stepped from the shadows between the pines. The tall man moved without hurry, as though the snow and darkness belonged to him. His long coat brushed the drifts as he walked, and the pale scar along his neck caught the lantern's glow like a line of frost. Behind him came Darren Holt. The big tracker carried his rifle loosely but ready, his heavy boots crunching slowly through the snow. Silas stopped at the edge of the forest, 30 yards away. Far enough for a gunfight, close enough for a conversation. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose the whole family reunion is here now." Clara's voice hardened. "Drop the weapon." Silas smiled faintly. "You first." The wind stirred across the lake again. Snow drifted between them. Relic's growl deepened. Silas's eyes flicked toward the dog briefly. "Still loyal," he murmured. Gideon stepped slightly forward. "You're done here, Silas." The tall man tilted his head. "Done?" He chuckled quietly. "You still don't understand, Gideon." His gaze drifted toward the frozen lake behind them. That archive you're protecting? It doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to history. Marcus shifted his stance. And tonight, history's going to jail. Silas sighed. You people never appreciate the long view. The rifle in Darren Holt's hands lifted half an inch. That was enough. Marcus fired first. The shotgun blast tore through the cold air like thunder. Holt dove sideways into the snow. Silas disappeared behind a tree trunk. Gunfire erupted across the forest. Clara fired twice toward the tree line. Gideon grabbed the lantern and dragged it behind a fallen log as another bullet cracked the ice near his feet. Relic barked sharply, then lunged forward despite his injured paw. The dog's sudden movement broke the stalemate. Silas fired again, but the shot went wide. Marcus advanced 2 steps and fired a second shotgun blast. This time Holt's rifle flew from his hands as the impact threw him backward into the snow. The big tracker groaned, clutching his shoulder. Silas realized the fight had turned. His eyes narrowed. For the first time that night, the calm hunter looked cornered. But he didn't run. Instead, he turned toward Gideon. And you still think you saved the wrong thing that night, Silas said quietly. The words struck harder than the gunfire. Gideon froze. Silas saw it immediately. His smile returned. Some ghosts never leave us. Relic suddenly moved again, not toward Silas, not toward Holt. Instead, the dog limped forward onto the center of the frozen lake. He stopped there, his dark eyes fixed on Gideon. For a second, the world seemed to narrow to just the 2 of them. The dog tilted his head slightly, a gesture Gideon had seen 1,000 times. But this time it felt different. It felt like a question, or maybe an answer. In that moment, Gideon realized something he had never allowed himself to believe before. He hadn't saved the wrong thing that night years ago. He had saved a life, and sometimes that was enough. The thought cleared something inside him. When Gideon looked back at Silas, his voice was steady. Maybe. Silas frowned slightly. Gideon continued. But tonight? You're the one who chose wrong. Marcus stepped behind Silas with the shotgun raised. Game over. For the first time that night, Silas Creed looked tired. Not defeated, but finished. Slowly, he raised his hands. Snow drifted down around them in silence. Hours later, the valley filled with flashing red and blue lights. Additional sheriff units arrived from the county station, their trucks carving paths through the snow-covered forest roads. Silas Creed and Darren Holt were taken into custody without further resistance. Clara watched as deputies loaded the 2 men into separate vehicles. Her face remained calm, but her hands trembled slightly once the doors closed. Behind her, an ambulance crew moved Elias and Martha Van onto stretchers. Elias tried to sit up as they lifted him. Clara, I'm here, Dad. The old man squeezed her hand weakly. We made it. Martha opened her eyes briefly. Her voice was soft. Did Noah come home? Clara swallowed. Then she looked toward Gideon. Yeah, she whispered. In a way, he did. 3 days later, the storm had passed. The town of Black Pine returned to its quiet winter rhythm. Gideon remained. He fixed the broken fence behind the van house, repaired loose boards along the porch, and patched a section of the roof that had been leaking for years. Relic rested nearby most of the time. The dog's injured paw had been treated by a veterinarian in town, a kind older woman named Dr. Helen Mercer, whose gray hair was always tied into a loose braid, and whose soft voice carried decades of experience with animals. She had examined the wound carefully. He'll walk fine, she had told Gideon, but he won't run like he used to. Relic didn't seem to mind. He spent most of his time watching the lake from the edge of the property, waiting. A week later, Elias Van passed away peacefully in his sleep. Before he died, he asked Clara to deliver a letter. The envelope was old, handwritten. Clara handed it to Gideon quietly on the front porch. Gideon opened it slowly. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was shaky, but clear. We always thought the lantern was waiting for Noah to come home. But maybe it was waiting for the man who would bring the light back with him. Thank you. Gideon folded the letter carefully. That evening, Clara hung the lantern on a hook above the porch. Its warm glow spilled across the snow-covered yard. Later that night, Gideon sat beside the frozen lake. Relic lay next to him, his injured paw stretched carefully across the ice. The lantern's reflection shimmered faintly across the frozen water. Gideon looked toward the distant highway that led out of town. He had driven roads like that for years, always leaving, always moving. He looked down at Relic. The German shepherd glanced back at him, calm and patient. Gideon smiled faintly. Guess we stay a little longer. Relic's tail thumped softly against the snow. Behind them, the lantern continued to burn, and for the first time in many years, Gideon Rourke no longer felt the need to keep running. Sometimes the miracles we pray for do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come quietly, through the loyalty of a dog, through the courage of a stranger, through a single moment when someone chooses compassion instead of turning away. In Gideon's life, the miracle was not victory in battle. It was the chance to protect life again when it mattered most. Maybe that is how God often works in this world. Not always through grand signs, but through people who appear at the exact moment someone else needs hope. A soldier who refuses to walk away. An old couple who keeps a lantern burning. A dog who never stops trusting the one beside him. Sometimes the light we are waiting for is not meant to guide us somewhere new. Sometimes it is meant to remind us that we are not alone, even in the coldest night. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little light today. Tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment in your life that felt like it was guided by something greater than coincidence? And if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing more stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your path, strengthen your heart in difficult times, and bring light into every dark place in your life. And wherever you are tonight, may you never forget that sometimes the smallest light can lead someone safely home.